Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. And we are back recording new shows. Dan has returned to us, and we're very happy to have you. Welcome back.
Well, thanks, Karen. I did visit Afghanistan, but most of my time was spent in Qatar. And I have officially retired from the military after 22 years. So it's been a long journey, and I'm looking forward to having one job instead of 2.5 is what I would call it.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge trying to balance, especially a job with Extension where there's a lot going on all the time, which is kind of a job and a half as it is, and then to throw in military service on top of that. It's a challenge.
Let's go ahead and make that 3 jobs then. 1.5 plus 1.5, right? Honestly, though, it's Extension's been great to me. They have really supported both the military career aspect and because the job is so flexible. Don't get me wrong, you can easily get overwhelmed, but it was a good job to be able to do that kind of balance too. So it was nice that I was able to put in the full 22 years. I've been doing it since I was 19.
Wow.
So it's nice to kind of have a different lifestyle almost, right?
Oh, yeah, completely. My brother just retired from the military himself, and he is also enjoying a completely different lifestyle. So it's definitely a strain on families, and we're glad to have you back.
Well, thanks, Karen. And just to kind of quote an old commander of mine, he used to say, whether you do 3 or 30, military always gets the best years.
Nice.
Yeah, so if you've only done 2, 3, or 4, don't feel like it was worth any more or less than that somebody with a 30-year career, because they're all your best years. So the military's always got them.
Well, I think you'll still have some pretty great years coming up, at least I hope so. And we're glad to be doing the show live again and getting some new content out there. And it's that time of year where people are putting up hay. We're going to talk about livestock today mostly, but it's it's hot, it's humid. We're trying to make sure that our animals, our livestock, are staying healthy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about biosecurity today for livestock. And while we'll be talking mostly about cattle from a beef quality assurance standpoint, all of these principles apply to any kind of livestock, whether it's chickens or goats or sheep or camels. It can apply to everything. So just because you don't have cattle doesn't mean that this subject isn't going to apply to you. So we hope you stay tuned.
Doing things the right way. Not quite the golden rule, but it's up there. Holding yourself to a higher standard, even when no one's looking. Your dad did it. His dad too. When the time is right, you'll pass it along. At National Cattlemen's Beef Association, we're for anyone who takes pride in doing things the right way. For more than 30 years, our beef quality assurance training and certification program has been guiding ranchers, veterinarians, and transportation professionals. BQA has become the standard for proper management techniques of the beef industry. It's a commitment to quality and improved profitability that helps raise consumer confidence in the safety and quality of their food. BQA programs educate and train professionals dedicated to moving the cattle industry forward. Professionals who take that responsibility seriously. The ones who've never cut a single corner or spoken the words good enough. BQA is for cattlemen who believe doing things the right way is the only way. And that's never going to change.
So let's talk about biosecurity. I mean, such a big fancy word that basically means keeping the diseases out, keeping the diseases at bay, contained, however you want to look at it. And there's just different ways that, if we're talking specifically about cattle, that diseases can be introduced. Animals can be vectors. They can incubate in our farms. They can actually be spread through the introduction of other animals, such as wildlife, even our own pets. They can actually move between different herds, whether you're taking an animal to a show, the fair, whatever. Diseases can harbor in our clothes and our shoes. Shoes especially. I mean, if you think about where diseases are typically located, on the ground, on the mud, on the poop that we step in, it's not hard to have that kind of stuff on your shoes and you walking from one place that's contaminated to a clean area. Sometimes within your own farm, sometimes in between farms, across the street to your neighbor, who knows?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said the word fair in that listing, because fairs are where a lot of things can get transmitted, because you go into fair and you still have to work the farm. So oftentimes you're going back and forth. And I always tell our 4-Hers to have a pair of fair boots that they only wear at the fair and they don't wear them at home. And that helps to reduce the potential for cross-contamination of bringing something from someone else's livestock that happens to be in the same barn as yours at the fair, and you go home to your animals on the farm. You could potentially bring something, plant it in the soil, and then a year or two later you have a problem. Where did it come from? Well, it came from the fair, and you just didn't realize you had brought it home at that time, because these things do take, especially when you're looking at bacteria, they sometimes take some time to grow enough in number to be able to be observable in the natural environment. So it's really important when you're thinking biosecurity, you're trying to keep problems out.
Yeah, and sometimes even inanimate objects such as vehicles, equipment. Sometimes we want to borrow a tractor or a forklift or whatever from a neighbor, and that's just that could easily be a vector of disease. Sometimes you can even have carcass of a dead cattle that haven't been disposed of properly. Maybe they're not getting buried deep enough, or you just don't know they're there. Could be in the water, for instance. Feed stuffs can be contaminated if you get too sloppy about it. Dirty water is a huge one to make sure you're looking out for. Keep animals out. If animals are going into a pond that then feeds into a spring or whatever, it could easily cause diseases that way. Or it can even just be transmitted through aerosols, like dust, aerosolized manure. If you're working with dry manure sometimes, or you're moving it.
And that's something that we should all be very aware of right now, is aerosol transmission. That's coughing, sneezing, making those liquid droplets into an aerosol where it floats through the air. And, I think we're all pretty aware of that right now with having to wear a mask and everything. Well, it's not really realistic to try to make your cattle wear a mask. So we're trying to keep the infectious diseases and the infectious agents out of your pastures and your livestock area.
Let's be realistic. The best thing you can do is not necessarily stop doing all these things we mentioned, because a lot of these things are necessary. You have to go home, feed your animals, but you can mitigate risk by understanding how these things can happen. Whether you're putting on booties, coming home from the fair, so that you're not introducing that fair stuff on your shoes into your farm, not driving into a certain area. Especially if your vehicle went somewhere that could be potentially a higher risk. Just understanding how these things spread and mitigating those problems, that could be the solution, or that could keep things from getting worse. So even slowing down a risk is a success.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah. And, I mentioned earlier that, this applies to all livestock, but with your statement that you just made, I'm like, oh, wait, this is what we talk about in the food safety programs as well for produce security. And that is, making sure you're not taking your wheelbarrow near the compost manure pile and then wheeling it right into your high tunnel, because that tire is going to pick up that manure and take it into your leafy green area. things like that. It's just being aware of where you are on the farm and what paths you're taking and what potential contamination can happen from point A to point B, making sure that you are assessing each of those risks and making sure that you have examined your farm and your actual activities. Even just making a little map of your farm and like, okay, here's the dairy barn, here's, the goat barn, and, we have these things together and these things separate, making sure that you can predict where cross-contamination might occur.
Yeah, and let's think about having the means to do certain things. It's great to have a barn or some kind of structure that you can put the animals into, maybe a holding pen that can house an animal for anywhere from 2 weeks, possibly a month, if they come from a high-risk area, before you introduce them to the pasture where the rest of the herd is. Is it feasible to do something like that? Do you have to introduce animals possibly slower? Instead of having a facility, can you possibly have a paddock that is completely isolated from the other herd? It doesn't have to be an indoor facility, but it would be really good to have some kind of isolation mechanism for introducing new animals.
Right.
You need to make sure your herd isn't diminishing as you go. Ideally, you're improving things and you're able to increase your stocking rate. That would be excellent. But you have to cull certain animals. Sometimes animals get sick. Sometimes they get hurt. Sometimes they're not viable anymore and they're not reproducing. So then they become a costly item to have. And you don't want to keep things that are draining your farm resources, because then you end up without a farm. So you have to manage these things. And the only way that you can keep livestock going, a cow-calf operation, for instance, is to make sure that you have cows that can calve. And a lot of times that does come with introducing new cows. Sometimes you want to introduce new genetics. That's another major thing. It's possible to maintain new animals within the farm, just kind of keeping a replacement heifers, let's say. But it is good to introduce new genetics every once in a while, possibly new wool, possibly new cows.
And don't forget those ever popular 4-H calves. That's a new animal coming onto the farm too. And, I really want to support having an isolation for any new animals coming onto the farm. This is really critical. It's just like having them in a temporary quarantine, guessing that they got exposed to something, and you want to see if they're symptomatic and could potentially spread something to your other animals. So I'm fully on board with having an isolation area. And like Dan said, it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be separate from the other animals. And it's really important when you're looking at your isolation that you consider, you don't want them to be at the top of the hill next to the stream, because if they drink from that stream and they're sick, they could pass things through that stream downhill to your other livestock. So you also want to think about, when you're setting up your isolation area, think about those external factors that could be helping to expand and spread that disease.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about some ways you can actually keep diseases out, more specifically in terms of practices you can implement without getting into necessarily species-specific things. For instance, strategic use of vaccines. Vaccinating your cattle or your livestock for specific things is a great way to not introduce new diseases into the herd, to keep things out of the herd. When you were talking about a holding pen, being able to have strategic vaccination plan for each operation. So what vaccines do you want your new herd to have so that they're not bringing in diseases that either you've been vaccinating for or just haven't been around, so they haven't been a problem in that area? Know when and how to use vaccines listed in the vaccination plan. So you have a vaccination plan. Do you have the means to implement those vaccines? And do you know the history of the cattle purchased before the cattle arrive? So if you know that they've been vaccinated for certain things, then your mitigation plan becomes easier than if you don't know and you have to figure this stuff out or just revaccinate with something that's very critical to your operation.
Right. And with any vaccination plan and really any livestock plan, you're going to want to make sure that you have a veterinary client-patient relationship that is established, that you have your vet come out to your farm, that they can establish the health and situations around your livestock so that when your livestock do get sick, have the vet come out before they get sick so that they know you, they know your operation, they know your animals. So when they do get sick, they can be more able to figure out what's going on and be able to identify what proper steps to take. So when you're getting your vaccination plan together, work with a local veterinarian and make sure that you have that veterinary client-patient relationship established ahead of time.
And there's a lot of good uses for the vet. And one of the things specifically we didn't get into, but it's very important. We did talk about disease containment, whether it's something that suddenly broke out or maybe it's something that happened while the animal was in isolation. But if it's something that isn't commonly seen, or even if it is, but you want to get on top of it, have animals that die examined by a vet. Figure out why that animal died. If you do have to, let's say, change that vaccination program, maybe introduce a new an antibiotic program because the disease is now there that wasn't there before. But stay ahead of that stuff. And the vet can help you collect blood samples from cows that might be sick or that have had abortions to figure out what's going on so that you can isolate those cows, figure out what's going on, and then possibly introduce a new vaccination program or some treatment plan that becomes maybe a little bit more feasible in terms of the cost doesn't become outrageous because the problem becomes too big, but also just even be manageable. So having the vet-client relationship that Karen was talking about and staying ahead of certain things that happen so that there is no mystery disease that can sneak up on you and then just ruin you.
Yes, and part of this whole thing is keeping good records. If you aren't keeping good records, it is next to impossible to remember what you did last week, nonetheless 4 months ago. Did you actually get that vaccination in, or was there a squall that day and you had to put it off and then you had to go back to work and got pushed off? So it's really important to know when you vaccinated which animal with what vaccination. And those animal health records are going to be key in making sure that you don't double dose certain animals, that you are making sure that you are using the right vaccination for the time period of that animal's life, and that you're also paying attention to environmental aspects of it. So if you have a really wet spring and there's a lot of deep mud, you're going to be more interested in maybe doing some preventative work towards blackleg or other soil-borne diseases that proliferate in those moist conditions. So like we said, work with your vet, get them to be aware of what your operation is like, and they can help guide you. You don't have to know everything there is to know about a vaccination plan for your livestock, but you need to have relationships with people who do so that they can help guide you along the way. And keep good records. Keep good records. With the Beef Quality Assurance Program, you're supposed to keep your records for 2 years after transfer of ownership. So you want to keep those livestock records even after you've sold off that livestock, so that if someone comes back to you and says, hey, your calf made my entire herd sick, you can say, well, that's not possible because my calf was vaccinated against the disease you're saying it had on this date with this time, and I did everything I could to make sure that that animal was the best animal it could be. So it protects you from a liability standpoint as well. So it's really important to keep those records, and I'm going to say it one more time, keep good records.
Yeah, Karen, and it's just amazing that when we start keeping records and putting things on paper, being organized about what we do, it's just amazing how much we improve. I've never seen a case where good record keeping has bit somebody in the butt, where that was just something that went against somebody. If you're keeping records, what that typically means is you're reading labels, that you're being organized, A lot of times, by being organized, by reading labels, you're also typically just increasing the sanitation practices, and you just become a better steward, both your animals and the land. One thing that we sometimes forget is if you're growing your own feed, we talked a little bit about feed, but even if you just have pasture and you're just doing good pasture management and you're making sure that you have good quality feed, and part of that control measure is to control the weeds. Well, a lot of times we do use chemicals. We do use pesticides. Having good record keeping gives you a sense of when you did certain things. And if you forget, you can go back and look and say, okay, well, I did spray this field. And let's say there's a 2-week restriction period where you can't bale hay from it. Well, let's say you're kind of doing it in peak season and you killed some weeds. 2 weeks later, you were trying to figure out which field did I spray. By keeping that good record now, what you've essentially done is you've mitigated the problem of storing a hay that may have a residual herbicide in it, feeding it to your animal, ending up with some kind of drug residue. And you just have to be very diligent about what you're doing. And the only way to do that and understanding what all is going on is to keep records. There is no way I could maintain my schedule without good record keeping. So it actually makes you a better farmer to keep good records. So turn a new leaf, make a new New Year's resolution, whatever it takes. That is a big step in improving your management and improving conditions in your farm.
And, my predecessor, John Miller, had a really great saying that the place you're going to make the most money on your farm is in the office. So it's fun to get out there and work with the livestock. It's feels like you're actually getting something done. When you're working them all through the chute and you get the last one through, you feel accomplished. But you are not done yet. You are not done until you've got all your records written down and in a safe place where you can access them. One of the beef quality assurance standards says it is more profitable to prevent problems than to correct problems. And there is so much truth in that statement.
Yeah, so let's just go into some specific things about calf management for biosecurity practices for calf management that really highlight some of the things that we've been talking about, so we can kind of see how it comes in fruition from just being a very generalized thought to something very specific like calf management. And a lot of people on this side of the state, whether you are in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, or Ohio, whatever side of the state that is, but this area, most have cow-calf operations, and most can relate to very specific calf management practices. So having a strategic vaccination and parasite control plan in place for all your animals. Keeping replacement cattle off pastures for 6 months is the recommendation where manure has been spread. So they're recommending keeping animals off pasture for 6 months where manure has been spread. And remember that manure is going to be a potential source of disease. Keep replacement cattle separate from other cattle for at least 21 to 30 days. Provide replacement cattle with a separate source of water so that there is no cross-contamination of a water source, maybe feedstuffs, whatever it's going to be. Consult with your vet annually about calf care. Ensure the calving area is clean and disinfected. We hit a little bit on sanitation, but sanitation is going to be one of the most critical points to keep the disease from spreading from point A to point B. And that includes using a tractor. A lot of farms have one tractor, and whether they're hauling manure or hauling feed, they're using that tractor. At least understanding that that's a potential source of contamination so that you do things in a certain order. Maybe you have time to hose it off. Maybe you can figure out the best way to keep real dirty stuff from making something that's not so dirty worse. Mitigation is the key there. Ensure all calves are born from cows that have been tested clean of infectious diseases. So having those vaccination records, having that good vet relationship where you know what's going on, and maybe the vet can give you a heads up. Hey, this stuff's, this disease is happening close by. So keep your eye on it. If you're getting your cattle from this location, there's been known outbreaks of this. So maybe you want to make sure to avoid that place, or even, go ahead and keep that replacement cattle separate for the 30 days instead of the typical 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how you've done something. Just knowledge is power, and being able to mitigate problems is the key to success. Ensure all colostrum fed to calves comes from cows that have been tested, clean of infectious diseases, and ensure calves are permanently identified prior to any grouping. So keeping things organized, keeping information accessible, and keeping your ear open for things, just a great way to operate. Try to read the local paper, just understand what's going on. Keep that relationship with your vet. Your vet's going to be the best source of diseases that have been happening. When there is a death of a livestock, the one person that typically goes and investigates is the vet. The vet's going to start the investigation. If it needs to go to USDA, if it needs to go to the Ohio Department of Agriculture, the West Virginia Department of Agriculture, whoever it is, that local vet is typically involved in it, and they can then disseminate that information out so that you could take proper protocols and keep that from coming into your farm. And whether it's going to be by a very specific change or just very broad biosecurity measures that can be used for a variety of animals or a variety of crops. Like Karen was saying, you were talking about the high tunnels.
It's all blended in together. If you just do one thing to help improve your livestock, that's great. But the more aspects of a biosecurity program you can build into your day-to-day thinking, the better off you're going to be. Biosecurity has 5 major components. You're looking at your assessment. You want to know the risks that are out there, whether it's from an incoming animal or the risks that are on your personal farm for cross-contamination. But also you want to think about resistance of the animals. You want to vaccinate them. You want to maintain them with good health. You want to make sure that they're getting the colostrum to help them build that immune system first off, right in the beginning. For isolation, you want to make sure that you are following that 21 to 30 day set aside period where they got to be off in their own pen, their own pasture. It's better than allowing them to mingle in with your herd, which could potentially make all of the animals sick. Also, think about your traffic control. Do things in a certain order, as Dan suggested. Always work from clean to dirty and not the other way around, so you're not bringing potentially infectious agent with you when you're going from one barn to the next. Keep your tools separate, keep your tractor going in the right direction, and avoid places where your tires could maybe run through a lot of manure, and take the time to actually clean it. That brings us to the last one, which is sanitation. Making sure that you're cleaning and disinfecting. Keeping things clean not only makes things look nice, but it also removes that potential for spreading infectious diseases. And so it's really important to keep things clean and to sanitize them as needed to make sure that you are not only keeping your own livestock healthy, but that you're keeping yourself and your family healthy, and also keeping other people's livestock healthy whenever your livestock move on. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.